Welcome to the Council on Social Worker Education's Critical Conversation series. Our topic today focuses on the role of the YWCA and the forced internment of about 120,000 Japanese Americans in camps during World War II. May happens to be Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and we are glad to bring you this very timely conversation. With us today is Dr. Yoosun Park. She is an associate professor and chair of the Human Behavior and Social Environment sequence at Smith College School of Social Work. In July, she will be joining the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania's School of Social Policy and Practice. She is also the author of the book, Facilitating Injustice. And I am Dr. Tanya Smith Brice, Vice President of Education at the Council on Social Work Education. Dr. Park, thank you for making this time for our conversation today. Can I call you Yoosun? Or?
Yes, please call me Yoosun. And
right.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So I'm going to share the screen. All right. So Yoosun, you talk about the role that social workers played in these camps during World War II. So from 1942 to 1946, thereabouts. And so if you could tell us a bit about those camps, what was going on, what was happening in this country, particularly as it relates to Japanese Americans.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so to start with, just to give the background on what happened, the rounding up of Japanese Americans and locking them up started actually immediately after, the day after Pearl Harbor, when war was declared, so in December of 41. But the whole-scale removal didn't start until the year after, in 1942. And all in all, approximately about 120,000 were removed, forcibly removed from their homes, and then locked up in 2 different sets of camps. And about 3/4 of that population were US-born citizens. So citizenship itself did not protect Japanese Americans from being removed incarcerated. And so they first went to what are called assembly centers. These were temporary camps, usually set up in places like racetracks, or county fairgrounds. So in Seattle, it was in the Puyallup campgrounds, for instance, or Santa Ana racetrack, so on and so forth. And so people were literally housed in stalls where animals were housed prior to this usage. And then they spent a few months there and then were moved to what are called relocation centers. And these are called relocation centers, relocation camps, and run by a civilian agency, which was created for the purpose, called the War Relocation Authority. And scholars and government workers and Japanese Americans call them concentration camps at the time. So these are all, in many ways, euphemisms, right? Relocation centers versus concentration camp. And the removal was usually called an evacuation, another euphemism. And I just want to point out that this whole endeavor the shorthand for this has been called internment. So the internment of Japanese Americans, and that scholars have moved away from that terminology in the past few years, really to point out that, the use of euphemisms is going to really perpetuate wrong ideas about these series of events. So thus, you will notice in my own work that what I called in my earlier work is the internment of Japanese Americans. Now I call the forced removal, incarceration, resettlement, which is a mouthful. Right. But I think that it is important, and the entire field has gone this way. And I just want to point out, although this is sort of a little bit esoteric, that there were internment camps, but that relocation centers where, or the concentration camps where most of the 120,000 were incarcerated were not actually internment camps. So those were internment camps were run by Department of Justice rather than the War Relocation Authority. And so that terminology is also really confusing. So if you see my articles, there's always footnotes about, here's the confusing bit about terminology, but just so that you have that in mind. And that those long-term camps, the concentration camps, were located in Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, and some of the worst real estate in the country. And that this is something that people don't really know about very much, but that resettlement was something that that happened out of these camps, and that the main point of resettlement was to, it's almost as soon as the camps opened, the concentration camps were opened, and people were moved there. And you know, that whole thing was predicated on the idea that it was dangerous to have Japanese Americans on the coastal states. But as soon as you move them in, then the government decided that they needed to move out and be resettled in the interior states. So they ended up going to 44 states in Washington, D.C. But that this was not something that most of the Japanese Americans wanted to happen. And social workers were involved in this very much. And the idea behind this resettlement movement was to scatter the Japanese Americans as widely as possible so that they would not reproduce Japantowns, and that you wouldn't have ethnic enclaves happening, because after all this, the Japanese were blamed for their own incarceration, with the idea that because they were concentrated and they were, you know, living with only themselves, that they were dangerous. So that scattering them and, you know, assimilating them fast would be a benefit to them, which is also something that we could talk about. And yeah, I guess I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, that's a very interesting context for these centers and assembly centers and the language of internment camp versus concentration camp versus relocation. I mean, resettlement and relocation centers is a very important piece that I hope that our audience gets, is that, you know, just the importance of language, so that we know what we're talking about when we're dealing with these. I was reading some work from George Takai, who talked about at age 5 being resettled or relocated to the Santa Ana stable, the racetracks, and living in these stalls, and just the horror of it all. Can I go to the next slide?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah, my dissertation chair, Professor Tony Ishisaka, he was born in one of these camps.
Oh, wow.
In Komachi. And I found that out once I started studying this. And because one of the interesting things was I started this project actually when I was writing my dissertation, because I came across a handful of articles that talked about this, maybe like 3 or 4, and went to every single one of my professors and said, do you know about this? How come we don't know about this? How come it's not in any history book about social work that I know of? And he was the only person who knew about the fact that social workers were involved in every step of the process. There's not a single person who was locked up who wasn't interviewed and registered and tagged by a social worker, because we did the intake for the entire process. So it really, I mean, I got interested in it because I thought, oh my God, how is it that it's not in any social welfare history book? How come we don't know anything about this? And so the book I wrote, you know, the articles came first, and then the book was a much more sort of in-depth foray into this. But I want to make the point that I'm Korean American, so I mean, I didn't feel like writing about the Japanese American history was my thing, right? It's not my story to tell. But what was my story was the role of social workers. So what did social workers do, and how come that entire history has been just erased from our memory? And what does it tell us about the contemporary issues today, about how we deal with issues of race, ethnicity, and newcomers and immigration and all those things? So
right. And most importantly, have we learned any lessons
Yeah.
from that. The article that you mentioned in addition to your book is the role of the YWCA in the World War II internment of Japanese Americans, a cautionary tale for social work. And this was in the September 2013 edition of Social Service Review. Highly recommend reading this article, and your footnotes are amazing. And so very excited about that. And so I mentioned YWCA. Tell us about who are YWCA and what role did they play in all of this?
So, I became interested in the YWCA because one of the things I was doing and hoping for in my research, I mean, this book took me 10 years to do because I was using, archival sources. Yeah. And I got interested in the YWCA because they seemed to be the only organization which was really involved the entire time. And they were really the only organization that came out and talked against social work involvement in this. So they had, I remember their, the archives for the YWCA are in at Smith College, luckily. So, but I remember there was a meeting note which said, working with the Japanese Americans and supporting them through this terrible process is something, not only something that we can do, but something we must do. Mm-hmm. And that attitude was was really unique to the YWCA. So that's not to say that the YWCA were perfect on this, so we can talk about that later, but just a really quick overview of who they were. The YWCA came about amidst this 19th century, mid-19th century evangelical Protestant movement, religious revivals. So it started in England, but the US branch started in New York City as the Ladies Christian Association of New York City. I think it was like 1858 or something like that. And the idea was that it started as a prayer circle, and it was about moral uplift and working with women to do better, to create better lives for them, but it was very religious at the time. And ideas about Christian sisterhood was at the basis. But by the early 20th century, I think there was hundreds of branches of YWCA everywhere in the United States. And the religious proselytizing had died down a little. And the idea of moral uplift and religious proselytizing went away, and it became much more of a social service agency. Mm-hmm. And it was two-pronged. Local agencies or local branches worked with especially young women who were flocking to big cities to go work in factories and for jobs. And then nationally, they were doing a lot of advocacy work. So, things like the vote for women, so on and so forth, and better working conditions and so on is something that they worked on as advocacy. So the other thing was that they were incredibly progressive on race issues. Right. That, and it's really surprising to most people. So for instance, they, in 1915, decided that to have their the first interracial conference. Mm-hmm. So all races were involved in Louisville, Kentucky, if you can imagine. And this is 1915, 1-5. Yeah. And in 1920s, the association voted to hold no more conventions in any legally segregated cities. So they said, we're not going to have any conventions in the South. And in 1940s, they advocated to end segregated blood collections, which was happening. The Red Cross was collecting blood for the war effort, but Black blood and white blood had to be collected separately. Right. And kept separately. So they protested against that, and then also protested against discrimination in military forces. In 1943, voted to remove all racial barriers to internal hires, and really promoted the idea that you can't just hire Asians and African Americans for jobs as cooks and so on. We need them in higher positions. And then in 1946, voted to desegregate the entire organization. Wow. So I think it's worth sort of thinking about how advanced that was, right? And
Right.
it's important to keep this in mind, because later I'm going to really talk about the fact that despite this progressive outlook, there were blind sort of fault lines that they didn't actually realize about their own racism. Right. And then the other thing just to mention is that they started what were called nationality divisions. Before 1946, when the entire organization desegregated, there were segregated branches for African Americans, and branches for Japanese Americans, and branches for Native Americans as well. So then these were called nationality divisions. So I can stop there for a minute, and or I can talk a little bit about the fact that this is an organization then started something called the Japanese American Evacuation Project. They decided that they would come up with this organizational center to work with the incarcerated Japanese American women. And so they put full-time staff. So they put money into it, as opposed to, this wasn't talk. They actually put money into it and developed a whole structure, and ended up creating branches of the Y in all of the 10 concentration camps, and were frequent visitors, and did lots of work with the women who were incarcerated.
So tell us about what was going on here in this picture.
So this is actually from a period of the events that people don't really know about, which is, this was in a period that was called the Voluntary Evacuation, meaning before the executive orders came to remove all the Japanese Americans from the coastal areas, there was a period where they were asked to voluntarily move away from the coastal states. And this is when social workers were brought in for the first time. So under the aegis of the Social Security Board, state social welfare organizations were given funds to help the Japanese Americans move into the interior. So this is a photo where, not that many families took it up, that offer, in part because most of them are farmers. And it wasn't like they could just up and move and say, okay, I'm going to work remotely, like we are doing today, but it wasn't possible for them to go anywhere. So this is a sign in California saying, you can't stop here. This is white man's country. So great deal of hostility and racism targeted against them, that nobody wanted them. Wow. Similarly, I think this was in San Francisco. This is when the whole thing started happening, when Pearl Harbor happened. It's, a huge sign. And then, this could be a sign from Chinatown today. Right. It's, big sign saying, I'm an American citizen. I was born here. Right. I'm not the enemy, which, as I said, didn't really have a huge effect, because 3/4 of the people who were locked up were American citizens. Right. And the other part that we should remember is that the other quarter who weren't American citizens were not allowed to become American citizens, because the 1790 Naturalization Act, which said only free whites could become naturalized citizens. And that was really upheld all the way until 1952 for a lot of East Asians. So the Issei, the first generation Japanese American immigrants, were not allowed to actually become U.S. citizens. So the idea that they were enemies, alien enemies, you have to weigh that against the fact that they weren't allowed to become anything else. Right. And the U.S. stands with Nazi Germany as having been the only nation to have barred naturalization on the fact of race. Wow. But then even the whole idea of, I think the term you use is Nikkei. So even those being American-born Japanese Americans were still treated as if they were not American. They were barred from that same value or that same power of being a citizen during this time period. Yeah, it's so true. So there's if there are lots of restrictive covenants against where you could live, thus the Japantowns. And the second generation, the Nisei, and the third generation Sansei, a lot of second generation Nisei were high school age, let's say college age at this time. They would get a college education and become a doctor, but couldn't practice anywhere because nobody would hire them. So many educated professional, college educated American citizens would end up working on their farms because they couldn't get jobs anywhere. And I think this is something that about Asian Americans that we don't often talk about. And there were so many laws. If I could just tell you one that really affected Japanese Americans, it was called there's a law that actually passed in about 18 states and was on the books until the 1950s. It was called the Alien Land Act, and it started in California. Yep. And that, and if you've ever read the book Snow Falling on Cedars or seen the movie, it talks about that. But what it said was that if you were an alien ineligible to become a US citizen, which the Japanese were, then you could not own land. And that was actually seriously, specifically targeting Japanese farmers who had really become successful, even though they were really small in number, they had become successful in very specialty farming, like berries and truck that they would sell and the back of their trucks. And the reason they became so successful in this was because the entire family worked on the farms, and they had some farming practices that were incredibly efficient. But anyway, so then they couldn't own land, which means that they couldn't actually buy land to farm. So then they started buying land in their children's names who were born here because they were citizens because they were born here. And then that got contested. But also they started, the Japanese farmers started renting land from white farmers. And so then an additional element got added to that law, which was that if you are an alien and ineligible to become a US citizen, you couldn't lease land for more than 3 years. And it takes about 3 years for something like strawberries to be planted and mature enough so that you can harvest. So there are lots of laws like this that targeted the livelihood of Japanese, not just Japanese Americans, but Asian Americans. And so many things that you couldn't do if you were ineligible to become a US citizen. One of them was a smart move, if you want to keep people out, was you weren't allowed to be an attorney. So,
So you couldn't really contest the laws, in that kind of way, which is interesting because there's an article that you highly recommend for folks to read called A Racial Trust, the Japanese YWCA and the Alien Land Law by Brantley, that really highlights the implications, contemporary implications for that, because there's property and buildings that were in the names of and bought by Japanese Americans, although they weren't, and then that land was taken from them, put in trust per se, and then folks kind of forgot about it, right? Until they're now going to sell the land, and it's like, oh wait, you can't sell that land. It doesn't really belong to you. It belongs to the Japanese American community, and so I find that fascinating, the ways that laws can be used to for these kinds of nefarious ends.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, the idea that somehow the Japanese were responsible for their own removal because they were too, cloistered, and they were too living only among themselves and would not assimilate. If you start thinking about then where were they allowed to live, right? It's a whole other matter. So this is a control station, meaning this is where the Japanese Americans were first sent. They had to, so once the posters went up that said, here's the executive order that says that you have to go, and you had 1 week. Technically you had 1 week, but it was often much shorter than that. Then where you had to go and register were at these control stations, which were sort of pop-up places that happened all over, up and down the coast. So these are social workers you're seeing who are with family. And those were taken from, borrowed from state welfare offices or county offices, and hundreds were borrowed for the time.
Wow.
This is, what's called entrainment. They had been entrained, meaning once they registered, were by the social workers, and then they were put on trains and sent to these temporary assembly centers where they were housed. And this was still under military control. So you see one at Santa Ana Assembly Center. So this is them getting off the train and now going to be sent to wherever barracks that they're going to go to. And the next one should show, this is a different assembly center, but the same idea. This is 10 Foreign in San Bruno, California. And this is what they arrived to. Mud everywhere. I mean, these were not habitations that were for people. Imagine. But these kind of conditions continued for a really long time. So many of the long-term camps that, if you go to the next one, I think we can see. So this is Manzanar, in Independence, California, but you can see the dust storm happening. But these camps, they didn't have heat well into the winter. Many of them, they didn't put windows in well into months and months and months and months into people living there. The latrines were shared, and especially the women were really just aghast at that. They had, toilets, bathrooms with no partitions.
Wow. You tell you tell an interesting story about when, and I know I'm probably moving ahead, so you tell me if I'm getting ahead of myself, but you tell a very interesting story about at the point when our government said, oh, okay, we're now going to shut down all of these camps, right? Like, we're just going to shut them down. And there were folks who were resistant to leave because, where are they going to go? And they, they're not really trusting how folks are going to receive them in these communities that they don't know anything about. And one way to get folks out was to shut down the latrines.
Actually, the most, what they did was, I'm just going to back up and just fill in a little bit about what you're talking about, which is that, so I think, most people are surprised to know is almost as soon as these camps opened, the government wanted to get people out. Yep. Right. But they wanted to send people out to the Midwest and then to the East Coast. And social workers are really, really, really involved in this also, because there were social work offices in each of the camps. And social work, one head of department, I forget which camp, said, okay, from now on, all our work is about resettlement, sending people out. So we can't think of ourselves as actually anything but a referral agency. And that whole endeavor is something that people don't know about, because, logically, if they're so dangerous that we needed to remove them and incarcerate them, then we'd want to keep them there for the duration of the war. But that wasn't the case at all. And then, the removal part was what the idea was to actually scatter the Japanese Americans widely, with the idea that if you remove them, if you scatter them and don't let them cluster again, then they'll assimilate faster.
Right. So there were actually laws about that, right? Like laws around the number of Japanese Americans who could be together on the street or congregated in a certain way in these new towns.
Yep, I know what you're talking about. Actually, they weren't laws, but these were social work policies.
Oh, wow.
So social workers would, be working with the Japanese Americans in, let's say, Chicago or, Denver or something like this. And as the people were going out of the camps, they were counseled that no more than 3 people should congregate. And if you're out in public, don't speak Japanese, because that way you don't want to be noticed, and you need to assimilate. So the social workers were really like befuddled by the Japanese wanted to hang out together. And because one of the, why would you, we've given you this opportunity to go out and hang out with white people, right? Mm-hmm. So why would you want to do this? And the other thing was the social workers were really concerned about was that living in these camps, even though, they knew very well that kind of food and whatever you got was so minimal, it was really subsistence, that they were getting dependent. They were developing this habit of dependency on the government, and that they were going to become basically welfare dependent. So we needed to get them out before they developed this habit of mind. But they needed to do it in a way that would make sure that they were becoming less Japanese and more American. So right. Central was this idea that if you were Japanese, you couldn't be American. If that makes sense.
So tell me about the disloyalty camps. What were those?
Oh, the disloyalty. That's actually really kind of complicated. I have a whole chapter in my book if you ever.
Oh, okay. Well, we can do that.
But I'll just say really quickly, at some point, it came about because this is also, it's hard to explain because in some ways it's so nonsensical. So anybody who was in the U.S. Army, the second generation who were citizens, prior to World War II starting, got removed, got thrown out, right? And then everyone was sent to these concentration camps and were locked up, living on behind barbed wire with sentries and, so on. And then all of a sudden, the US government wanted to draft the young people to send them to war. So the loyalty questionnaires came out of, in part as a way to cull them to see who should be sent, who could be considered loyal. So they had to answer these questionnaires, which became a huge problem because the questionnaires were badly administered. The questions were terrible and really confusing. And then also, if you can imagine, you're locked up as alien enemies, even though you're a US citizen, and now you're going to get drafted and to go fight while your parents and your family are still locked up. So this created a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? And a lot of problems for families. So the loyalty questionnaire, too hard to explain right now. And social workers were very much involved in administering those questionnaires and then dealing with the aftermath as well.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about the YWCA. So they were, like you stated earlier, a very progressive organization. Notably, one of my sheroes, Dorothy Height, served on the board for the YWCA during this time period. But in spite of that progressiveness, there was still this attitude of Americanization and assimilation. So talk a bit about that and what are the implications for social work practice today?
Thanks for that question. So I actually have a quote from Dorothy Height because one of the interesting things about YWCA and something that we've sort of forgotten about is that it thought of itself as a group work agency. And group work in that, sort of an old sense. And the quote from Dorothy Height is that, who joined the National Board, as you said, in 1944, an African-American social worker, that she described group work as an educational process aimed at the development, social adjustment, and growth of the individual through voluntary group association and the use of this association as a means of furthering socially desirable ends. And for group workers, I think the biggest sort of goal of what a socially desirable end was improving our democracy. And they really believed that that was the ultimate ideal of group work, to practice true democracy, and that required the full and intelligent participation of all its members, including the Japanese Americans. And that so social reform in the sense of we need to get rid of racism was one of its ideals. But I think that the big but comes from the idea that, and I think this is also still true for today, what that meant for the YWCA was that even though they were so much better than any other organization and really practice sort of what I call protocultural pluralism in ways that other organizations in social work did not do. But still there was this idea that to become the way that the Japanese Americans would become integrated was a one-way direction. And so here was a society, right? Structurally, the society wasn't going to change at all. And that Japanese Americans would have to learn how to become part of that. So here's white society, and they were going to come here and become better fitted there, which is why I don't speak. And so a lot of their work in the camps and in the clubs, like girl groups and so on, were designed to really promote this very assimilationist idea, with the ideal being the white middle class woman. And interestingly, the War Relocation Authority, which ran the concentration camps, decided that somewhere along the way that in order to really promote people going out for resettlement, that they were going to hire somebody who was a group worker. So they started hiring group workers, and they used group work principles, including the YWCA, and really relied on the YWCA to promote resettlement. And what they would do was things like the WRA would stop funding or put, stranglehold on funding for Japanese activities. So anything like, judo, Go, or like calligraphy classes, those were no. And social dancing, so dances put on by the YWCA, or baseball games, or any activity that was considered American. That and those were the kinds of activities that the YWCA really headed up, were considered the good things to do, because they wanted to prepare the Japanese Americans to go out and fit into society, right? And so, but underneath all this is the idea, the fundamental idea that to be Japanese is not to be American.
That's right.
So in many ways, you have to kill the Japanese in order to become American, right?
That's right.
And so that's why I say, despite all their progressivism, they couldn't see Americanization. They couldn't see integration as becoming a two-way street. Because if you think about, if you really, really are a pluralistic society, then you have to be willing to change structurally.
That's right.
With the people that you're getting, right? So no, but I mean, that wasn't what's happening. And there's one quote that I brought along to read to you, because the fears that the children were becoming de-Americanized by hanging out with so many of the older folks was really, really scary to them. And there's a quote, let's see if I can find it, by one of the YWCA workers. And the idea is, where is it? Oh, here it is. And her name was, the woman who's saying this is named Winifred Weigel. And she's actually, real proponent and a serious supporter of the Japanese Americans, and thought of the whole endeavor of locking them up as a racist endeavor. But this is what she says. So many of them, meaning the Japanese girls, are lovely, even beautiful. So many look more American than Japanese.
Wow. And
that's her praise of and in a context saying that thus we should really welcome them into our society. So just in that one phrase, you can see that regardless of where their politics were up front, there is this like deeply embedded idea. So that the flattery that she can muster up is that they look American. Right. They're beautiful because they look American and they don't look so Japanese. That's right. And that is the kind of thinking that was really underneath all of this.
So what can we learn from this whole experience? It seems like we're in a perpetual Groundhog's Day, right? Because
Yes.
we're still, we can still see these same things. As I'm listening to you talk, I'm like, oh yeah, that also worked in the Black community as
Yep,
well, same kinds
absolutely.
of things. And even today, we're still, with that. What are some lessons that we can take from this as social workers, and particularly social work educators?
So I think one of the lessons that we should always keep in mind is that despite all their progressivism and the best intentions, and doing better than anybody else did during this time, any other social organization that is, that it didn't mean that they were without bias,
Right.
or that they weren't racist, right? So I think we can't sort of go to this binary that says, if they meant well, therefore they're good, or they tried really hard, so it was okay. I mean, a few years ago, I was invited to give a talk at the national meeting of the YWCA in Washington, D.C. And there was actually an African-American scholar. She was from, I think, North Carolina, whose the field of study was about these African-American branches back in the day. And she told a really interesting story, which was that, so desegregating them meant that they got rid of these nationality branches, right? And one would think that that's a great idea, right? We're going to desegregate, everyone's going to be together. But she said the actual result was that when there were African-American only branches, African-American women were in charge. They were the directors, they ran the show, right? And once they got desegregated and got mushed into just with these branches with everybody, they were no longer in charge of anything. It was the white women were in charge. So she really, exhorted us to think about, what are the unintended consequences, right? And it's not like just because the YWCA decided to desegregate, it meant that racism went away and that somehow, in these formerly white branches, that the Black women were going to be put in charge, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I think that is very similar to what I'm saying, is that, good intentions don't get you to the place that you want to. And I guess I really want to know, I want my work, whatever work that I'm doing, to really incite social workers to think about, what are we doing today? What are we complacent about today? And what are we missing, right? What are we not looking at? And, one of the things that the YWCA was good for was that they actually paid attention to what was going on, whereas no one else did. Yeah. But so what are the topics that we're missing entirely? And that 50 years from now, I say this to my students all the time. So 50 years from now, what are we going to look back on and say, oh my God, I can't believe we did this, right? And so my goal, my hope is that social work would come to a place, or at least want to know enough and do enough critique of its own current practices to try to avoid some future historian coming along and saying, really, you did that, right? As I'm doing today. And so, and then, and to think about just in this moment about Asian Americans, because it is Asian American History Month, this idea that Asian Americans are the perpetual foreigner. Even born here, even if you've been here for generations, I keep getting asked to do talks on Asian Americans, but it's always in the context of immigration. It's as if we can't imagine Asian Americans outside of being immigrants. That's whereas, you never talk about Irish Americans as immigrants, right? So why is this idea of this perpetual foreigner, this newcomer, always hand in hand with when we think about Asian Americans, is something I'd like us to think about. So, and this double bind, really, that we're perpetual foreigners and we're never we're never us. We're never American enough to be considered important enough to actually study, to protect, to do anything. Because when I see all these videos where the bystanders are not doing anything, right, where Asian Americans are getting attacked, this is what pops into my head, sort of the macro photo picture of social work has never actually paid attention to any Asian American issues.
Absolutely.
And it's as if, you know, so I mean, when I say the double bind, meaning I mean Asian Americans are discriminated against by law, by practice, anything else, but at the same time, it's never Asian American communities have never been considered enough of us for social work to actually pay attention to.
That's right. That's
right. Does that make sense? Is what I'm saying?
That does. That absolutely does. It absolutely does. And yeah, we've just got a lot of work to do. I think this story, this part of our history has to be put in our policy curriculum, has to be integrated throughout our social work curriculum. And so I'm just very thankful. You've been doing this work a very long time. And there needs to be more Yoosun Parks doing this work, or others, Tanya Smith Brice's doing this work, to tell these stories and to correct the narrative. Tell me, do you have a title for your new book coming out?
I do. I mean, I said something to the publisher.
I know what that's like. I know what that's like. I'm the worst with titles. Even my own titles, I'm the worst with. So yeah.
No, so I'm still playing with it, but it's about the Americanization.
Okay.
So Americanization being this movement that happened between around the turn of the century. Right. So, a few decades on either side, where everyone was involved. I mean, public schools, I mean, like the Ford Motor Company had an Americanization office. And very much this idea that you had to shed everything and become Americanized, with this idea that, and what is that target of Americanization? White America, white middle class American. Right. And I think I was saying this to you before we started, but that interestingly, that notion of Americanization, the need to assimilate and Americanize, were applied not only to immigrants coming, but also to Native Americans and Black Americans who were on their path to the North. So as they're leaving the South and coming up North, social workers are saying we need to Americanize them and assimilate them, because they don't know how to be American.
That's right. That's right.
So
when does this book come out?
Oh gosh, hopefully next year. Okay. But it's another archival research, so these things take long. But also the Native Americans actually was something that for Native Americans, to Americanize Native Americans, if you do see the irony there. But the idea was there that we needed to completely destroy and remove them from their way of life, because tribal connections was keeping them from becoming civilized. Yeah. And that, so thus the boarding schools. But, it wasn't enough to send them to boarding schools, because once they left the boarding schools and went back to their tribal groups, then all that Christian education was wasted. That's right. So Americanization movement also really wanted to get rid of the entire tribal systems and any kind of way of life that wasn't white middle class. Right.
Well, I am so glad that you agreed to play along and talk to me about your research. I think this is very instructive to us as social work educators. And I want to thank you for this. So
I really want to thank you for the opportunity. I'm very honored to be invited, and it's been super fun talking with you. And we could talk for hours.
I know we could. All right, thank you.
Thank you.